I love to get out into nature, but I don't have any company for this, and I have to go alone. I'll tell you about one of these trips now. It was summer. I left the office happy, having received a 2-week vacation from my boss. Looking forward to a great trip, I loaded everything I needed into the car and hit the road. The road was long. I did not expect to travel such a long distance in one day. I didn't take a tent with me because I could easily sleep in the car, folding out the front passenger seat. After 6 hours of driving on an almost straight road, I began to fall asleep. We had to find a place where we could park the car and spend the night in it. I didn't want to be on the side of the road, and it was impossible. I had to find some clearing, and around there was only forest and forest. I drove another 10 kilometers and suddenly noticed an exit from the road to the village. I was very surprised, because who would live or build a dachi in such a wilderness? There are 200 kilometers to the nearest city. However, this village made me very happy, but after a few minutes my joy subsided. The village turned out to be abandoned. No, it was not destroyed, but abandoned. It looked as if all its inhabitants had left it about 3 months ago. But this did not stop me. In general, there was nowhere else to spend the night, and I parked the car near this village in a small clearing, surrounded on almost all sides by dense impenetrable forest. Having unfolded the passenger seat and sat down on it, I went to bed. However, my sleep did not last long. At about 3 in the morning, I heard a knock on the car window. A little chilled, I turned to the glass. The thoughts in my head were confused. Opening my eyes, I saw this. A strange creature was knocking on my window. His head looked like a stump that they started sawing, but not finishing it completely. They left it there. Its jaws opened almost 180 degrees. Its mouth filled with yellow and sharp teeth. The skin was pale, the eyes were yellow, and the pupil in them was narrow and red. Instead of a nose, there were 2 holes. It was then that I experienced a feeling that I will remember for the rest of my life. Feeling of hopelessness. I couldn't do anything. If I get out of the car, I will only become an easier prey. I'll remain lying in a stupor. It will break the flimsy car window and get me. Then I was controlled by panic. I don't even remember when I decided to get into the driver's seat and try to get away from the monster, but that's exactly what I did. The engine roared, and in a panic I rushed on my iron horse, far away from this damn village. However, the monster did not want to give up and ran after the car. I pressed the gas to the floor and drove as fast as I could, but the monster did not lag behind. It ran on all fours and slowly caught up with the car. It was already a meter from the car when I noticed a turn, which, fortunately, turned out to be an insurmountable obstacle for the monster. I pressed the gas until I reached the nearest town, and there I already booked a hotel room. I had nightmares about how that monster finally caught up with me and ate me. I woke up in a cold sweat when it was already 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Somehow I got up and went on to my relatives, but on the way I was afraid of everything in the world. Fortunately, I was returning back by a different route, not through the forest. Already at home, I remembered the DVR that was in the car and recorded everything that happened. Honestly, I didn't want to see what happened that night, because even remembering it was terrible. However, curiosity overcame fear, and I pulled out the memory card from the recorder and inserted it into the computer. Having rewinded the video to the right moment, I saw the monster running out of the forest. I was surprised. How was it able to overcome the impenetrable thickets? But the worst thing awaited me ahead. At the moment where I was leaving the village in panic, the video recorder recorded a decomposed corpse, gnawed almost to the bones, in the window of a nearby house on a table in the center of the room. No, the villagers did not leave. Death overtook them right in their own homes. God, I almost went crazy at that moment, but somehow he was able to cope with the madness and began to live on, not thinking about the abandoned village that had become the abode of the monster. We were delighted that my sister Isabel was coming to visit us in Mexico in November 2019. We had been exploring Oaxaca and were excited to show her some of the best spots we had uncovered. With only 10 days, we set a quick pace to fit in the mountains, beaches, ruins of Oaxaca, and the culture and food of Oaxaca City. Returning to Oaxaca City from the beautiful coastline, we discovered a shortcut that would shave an hour off our trip home. And having learned nothing from any of the other shortcuts we had ever taken in Latin America, we enthusiastically set off. As we turned off the main highway, the road quality immediately began to deteriorate as a potholed road took us past farms and small rural villages. As the houses became less frequent, things began to get really hairy. The paved road gave way to a gravel road, which eventually gave way to a dirt track. I stopped to survey my charts, Google Maps, and could see that the road would soon join up with a larger road where it would surely return to paved roads. Despite Kelly's anxious urging to double back the way we came, unwilling to face the truth, I plunged further on into the wilderness. The track continued to deteriorate, and we continued to bump along down the washed-out old GO track, refusing to accept defeat and drive back, humiliated, to the coastal highway. The two passengers begged me to turn around as the car bounced along, shaking loose anything and everything that wasn't held down. Eventually, we could go no further. Google had betrayed us and led us directly into a trap. The road, which was now single car width with large washouts on either side, ended in front of us at a large rushing river. There was nowhere to go but back. Unfortunately, there wasn't enough room to turn the car around. With no other option, I embarked on a 17-point turn to try to turn the vehicle around on the narrow track. Obviously, I couldn't. The car became stuck in the deep gutters at the edges of the narrow road. Now frantic, I leaped out of the car to check the damage. Realizing our situation, Kelly and I resigned ourselves to digging the car out. My sister exited the car and backed up to get a better vantage of how this was going to play out. With our rear wheels trapped in a large washout, leaving the rear bumper resting on the sand, I set about jacking up the car to try to fill in the washouts that had trapped the wheels. After jacking up the car, we were able to move some of the dirt, sand, and rocks trapping the wheels. But suddenly, as the car came free, it lurched forward, falling off the jack, which was precariously balanced on the uneven gravel road. Now, even more stuck, I continued to dig. After 10 minutes of wild digging in the dirt and sand, a bemused Mexican family came upon us, 3 hapless gringos. Kelly turned to the family and smiled ruefully, LS Loco gesturing to me and then to her own head to help them understand that I was an idiot and quite possible crazy. The family set about helping us free the car, and with their help, we were eventually free once more. I was able to complete my 17-point turn, and we were facing the right way. Finally free, we parted ways with our saviors, shoving pesos and some cold beers into their hands before setting off back toward the beach. After an awesome weekend spent hiking Carnarvon Gorge in outback Australia, we returned to our van, ready to make tracks back to the beautiful Queensland coastline. When we swung open the rear doors, we were aghast to find a river of dried blood coating the floor of the van. Tracing the spill back to its source, we found that it was not blood but a package of liquid beef stock with one tiny corner expertly chewed through. We also came to find teeny bits and pieces of food and mouse poo scattered throughout the car. It seemed a tiny visitor had helped himself to a little of everything on offer in our pantry. After cleaning up the mess, we set off laughing at the midnight feast the little fella had enjoyed, presumably before returning to its mouse family and little mouse house. We did not suspect that this particularly ghastly vagrant mouse had no family, no house, and we now had a stowaway aboard. That night, as we drifted off to sleep, Kelly whispered urgently at me, "What's that noise?" A faint scratching could be heard from inside the car as the stowaway emerged for another midnight rampage. Without a mouse trap on board, I began to setting up a variety of contraptions and devices a la Tom and Jerry, using pots, pans, pens, and string. Any zany mousetrap idea my half-asleep brain could come up with. Meanwhile, Kelly repacked all the food she could into mouse-proof containers, and the rest we took to bed with us to protect from the home invader. It was now 1 a.m. and we had to be up for work in 4 hours. Despite how tired we were, we found ourselves waking up every 15 minutes, certain we could hear the home invader rustling around in our drawers and cupboards. The next day, having checked my pots and pans, only to find them empty, it was off to get real mousetrap from the hardware store. The woman at the hardware store recommended cheap sticky pads to catch the mouse. Perfect. I thought naively. The sticky trap will stop the mouse in its tracks, and in the morning I will be able to free it back into the wild. How humane. That night we baited the new trap with popcorn, a mouse favorite judging by the number of kernels spread throughout the vehicle, loaded up our bed once again with all the foods we couldn't mouse-proof, crawled into bed next to the groceries, switched off the lights and waited. We didn't have to wait long before the scratching of the mouse let us know that the mouse was on the prowl. We waited a few more minutes until his panicked squeaks informed us that the trap was sprung. Aha! I screamed at my vanquished foe, switching on the light and jumping out of bed. My triumph was fleeting as I saw the poor mouse tied up in knots, with its head, fur, feet, and tail all stuck to the glue trap. This mouse was not getting free from the trap. Guiltily I carried the trap and tiny mouse to a trash can nearby and closed the lid. Back in bed I felt relief but very sorry for how we'd gone about catching the mouse. As I drifted off into an uneasy sleep, it was almost as if I could hear our little friend again, scratching away through the car. In fact, I could swear I could hear a mouse. There were of course more mice in the house. We had only bought one trap, and that trap was now at the bottom of a trash can. We spent another night being terrorized by wild vermin. Day 3 of the mouse house standoff saw us back in the hardware, this time to find real spring-loaded traps that would end the mice brutally but quickly. That night we prepared for siege one final time. Groceries were loaded into the bed, traps were laid, and the pantomime of going to bed was staged once more. Late in the night, we took out the last 2 intruders, and finally fell into a deep restful sleep. Not even 2 hours into entering van life, I was bright-eyed and bushy-tailed off to my first destination, Idaho. I was traveling north from Utah, and it was a sweltering hot day in early June. The radio was blasting. My windows were down, shades were on, and I was feeling it. Cruising down the main highway with 2 lanes, I came to a random stoplight. Typically, you don't see traffic lights placed on a main highway, but thinking nothing of it, I braked and came to a stop. Once the light turned green, I pressed the gas pedal to, well, go, but nothing happened. The engine didn't rev, the van didn't move. The gas pedal felt like a floppy fish. People behind me started honking until they realized I wasn't going anywhere anytime soon. I was so baffled and caught off guard that all I could think to do was turn the engine on and off. The van was starting just fine, but the gas pedal did nothing. As the first flood of cars skirted around my van, I became increasingly worried at the second wave approaching within seconds. Even though I turned on my hazard lights, it was so bright outside that you could hardly see them. My van was sitting in the middle of a highway at a green light, taking up the full lane at a total stop. I was absolutely terrified I would be rear-ended or cause an accident. I turned my head and made eye contact with 2 men in a pickup truck who were in the turning lane next to me. I started rolling down my window, and they seemed to instantly understand I needed help. I got out of my van and yelled to them, "Can you tow my van?" They pulled their truck in front of my van into the intersection and quickly worked to chain the van to the back. I was trying to direct traffic away from my van in the meantime, and finally hopped in to steer while it was pulled off the road. They relocated my van safely onto the side of the road, and I gave them the biggest thank you possible. I felt incredibly lucky to have had such quick help and to have avoided an accident. From there, the rest was less eventful but still unpleasant. I sat in my sweltering oven of a van for the next almost 2 hours waiting for my insurance to send a tow truck. My van's AC is broken. From there, I was towed to a dealership 2 miles down the road. The good news was that since it was only 2 miles away, the tow lift distance was within my coverage, so it was free. The bad news was that it was a Saturday and the dealership wouldn't open until Monday, so I spent a couple nights at a motel down the street and explored all the beauty of this random town I was in. Ultimately, I never found out what caused the van's gas pedal to stop working. Our best theory is vapor lock because it was such a hot day, but by the time the dealership checked, the van worked just fine. It was, however, very low on oil. And I swear since that oil change, other little issues I'd noticed seemed to vanish. I know logically this doesn't make sense, but it's what I've observed. While breaking down on a highway was scary in one way, this next story was scary in a different kind of way. The most anxiety-inducing way, because you're not sure of others' intentions. One evening I was exploring a northern city in Oregon without a camp spot in mind. As the sun lowered in the sky, I checked iOverlander for any nearby spots. Nothing, except one listing way off in the woods, about a half-hour drive from where I was. The vibes throughout Salem were not great. I felt sketched out and decided I'd head to that remote spot even though I didn't like how remote it looked. Nothing felt ideal at that point. Driving there felt like a bad scary movie scene. The roads got narrower, less maintained, and more enveloped by thick forest. The directions were telling me to go down what looked like someone's dirt driveway, which I did hesitantly while realizing the road opened up into a logging road. The road dramatically twisted and turned down a steep hill, pitching me into darkness, and this is where I lost cell phone service. The road eventually plopped me onto this main drag completely surrounded by thick forest on either side. At this point, the sun had set and it was very, very dark. I continued driving until I found the trailhead parking lot listed on iOverlander. There was a bathroom with bullet holes in the door of the women's restroom and one other car at the opposite end of the lot. I thought to myself, well, I kind of really hate this, but I just drove pretty far to get here and it's too late to look elsewhere. I settled in for the night, reassuring myself that darkness and lack of cell coverage didn't automatically mean murder death. But as I started drifting off to sleep around midnight, I heard the last thing I'd want to hear: a car pull in. I listened closely to evaluate with my ears as best as possible. I heard people walking, and then I heard glass smash. I heard voices loudly talking and lots of doors opening and closing. Then, I saw streaks of light pass through my window covers. That's when I got really freaked out. Over the next hour, I peeked through my window cover and watched, I think, 4 different guys walk back and forth behind my van. It seemed like they were constantly looking at my van because they were wearing headlamps that would shine through the window covers. They would yell, and one of them even started howling. One minute I'd think I was good because they'd walk into the woods, but then they'd circle back to their car and I'd get scared. I asked myself, Hillary, even if these guys head off into the woods for the night, will you be able to fall asleep? And I knew the answer was no. I needed to drive away, but I'd built it up so much in my head that I wondered, what if they followed me? But the final straw came after about 2 hours of listening to them yell and blast their bad music, because I heard gunshots. They'd gone into the woods to fire them, but once I realized they had guns, I lost any sense of safety provided by my van. So I waited for a brief moment where they'd all headed to the woods and booked it out of there at 2 a.m. I drove about 20 minutes back up the deathly steep hill and the winding roads and into a little town. I posted up at a small park and didn't care if I was kicked out at that point. There was a semi-truck there as well, so I figured I'd be good. That's when I learned to do a better job at trusting my instincts. The moment I had seen the listing of this place, I had uneasy feelings but wrote them off out of desperation. Never, never again. I'm going to combine 2 different incidents into one story because they happened so close together. While different experiences, they felt similar and related for some reason. And the first one is more just odd than anything. A few weeks ago, my BFF came to join me on the road. After spending a few days on the Oregon coast, we decided to head to one of my favorite camping spots in Oregon. We got a late start in the day, and by the time we arrived, it looked a lot creepier at night than I was hoping. I wanted to show her how cool the place was, but instead we pull up to a dusty spot in the woods where there's a big circle with a pentagram in the middle, drawn into the ground. There's a piece of a broomstick in the center of the pentagram. It was almost a full moon as the moonlight slivered through the treetops down on us. Definitely set a creepy vibe, but after talking about it, we decided to just turn our music up really loudly as we sat around the campfire. Part of me wants to say we ended up having a ghoulish experience that night, but nothing happened. I've also since learned that witchcraft isn't inherently creepy. In fact, it's a practice to become more connected with Earth. It's not something to be feared, but it did make another experience I had a few days later feel that much stranger. Wishing I knew more about human anatomy and bones, I tried to Google human bones and mash them to what I'm seeing. Nothing jumps out at me, but I decide I should alert local authorities anyways. So, I end up reporting it to police and they send 2 officers to the location. I meet them on the side of the highway and guide them through the maze of dirt roads. When it comes to van life horror stories, it doesn't get much worse than waking up to find a stranger in the van with you. It happened to us in the dead of night while traveling from Mexico. Palenque is the closest town to the famous Mayan ruins of the Palenque archaeological site and to the waterfalls of Misilha and Agua Azul, but beyond its proximity to some of Chiapas' stunning historical and natural attractions, the town itself doesn't have much to recommend it. A city yet to capitalize on the tourism market that flocks here to explore Chiapas, Palenque has a reputation as a dingy and somewhat dangerous town. In our limited experience, the reputation is unfortunately warranted. Arriving in the afternoon, we elected to explore the city on foot to discover the charm we were sure others must have missed. After a couple of laps of downtown, we had to concede there wasn't much here to attract tourists. We felt a bit uneasy about camping in the car right in the middle of town and decided to park nearby to the tourist district at the eastern end of the town center. After an expensive beer in a depressing tourist bar, we decided to turn in for the night, excited to leave for the Palenque ruins first thing in the morning. In a moment of madness, we decided to park and camp in an unlit section of a dark street, around the corner from the small tourist district. When looking for safe places to camp in cities, the general rule is the more lighting and visibility, the better. At the time, already feeling uneasy about the city, we thought if we were out of sight we might be less likely to attract unwanted attention. A terrible decision in hindsight. Around midnight, as we were falling asleep to the sound of the rain outside, someone came past the car and tried to open the locked doors. I yelled loudly and jumped out of bed, pulling back the window covers, but couldn't see anyone on the darkened street. That event should have set off alarm bells and provided the motivation for us to seek out a safer place to camp for the night. But tired and sleepy, we reasoned that it was just an opportunistic local who had tried and failed to make an easy score. They would have no doubt heard my yells, realized someone was in the car, and wouldn't return. With that, we fell into an uneasy sleep. In the pitch black, I awoke to a sound I had never heard before and hoped to never hear again. Kelly's piercing, blood-curdling screams seemed to go on and on. "What's happening?" I mumbled foggily. "There's someone." "In the car," Kelly cried, shaking me violently. "There's what?" I murmured, rubbing my eyes. "And now he's getting away," Kelly shrieked. Drowsy and struggling to find my bearings in the pitch black, I swung myself out of bed, fumbled for the door handle, wrenched open the door, and jumped out of the car. By the time I found myself on the dark, wet street, there was no one to be seen. I clambered back into the car. "What just happened?" I asked, now fully alert. "I woke up thinking you were whistling about and asked what you were doing," Kelly recounted, "but then I realized that you were fast asleep and the whistling was coming from the front seat. I looked up and I could just see the beady eyes of a man looking back at me. He must have only just realized we were in the car at that moment too, because he paused for a minute. That's when I started screaming and he took off." "Poor Kelly," I whispered to myself, stroking her fevered forehead. "She's had a terrible dream." "No, I haven't, you man. Check the front." Sure enough, the locked barrel on our passenger door had been removed and a handful of items the thief had managed to grab in his panic missing. Thankfully, he had only grabbed an old raincoat and a camera lens. We were able to replace the locked barrel some days later in Merida. It would be a bit longer before we slept through the night. There is little mysticism in this story, but it is pure truth. It was 2 years ago. My relatives and I were going to the dacha. There was a small house. There was not enough space. We mainly came for fishing, but my late grandfather, may he rest in heaven, loved him very much, raised an apiary there, and there were beehives. We arrived late, somewhere between 01:00 and 03:00. At this time, of course, it was stupid to go fishing. We decided who would sleep where. There was little space. As I already said, 3 people lay down in the house. One was on the floor. I didn't lie down there. I decided to sleep in the car. So we said goodnight to everyone and went to bed. I got into the car, listened to the radio for a bit, and for about 30 minutes I couldn't fall asleep. But then I didn't even notice how I fell asleep. I hear a knock, as if someone is knocking on glass. I thought, friends, who else could there be? stood up, and everything became quiet, as if nothing had happened. I wanted to fall asleep again, but I no longer wanted to sleep at all and was tormented and tossing and turning. I heard the sound of a smoker, as if someone was smoking behind the house. I didn't get up, but wanted to fall asleep quickly. Time passed, I still couldn't fall asleep, and the sound of the smoker kept ringing in my ears. I decided to go out, smoke, and at the same time see what was behind the house. That sound was coming from there. As soon as I opened the door, everything went quiet. I ignored this sound and, opening the door slightly, smoked a cigarette. Before I had time to close the door, the sound of a smoker began to sound as if right outside the door. I tried to fall asleep, but I couldn't. The sound was getting closer. I got out of the car and went into the house to sleep. Lay down on the floor, and I hear the sound of water, as if someone turned on a faucet. I got up and went to the kitchen, but there was no one there. Before I could get into bed, I heard heavy footsteps behind me. I turned around, but there was no one. I was lying there trying to sleep, and I heard a sound like someone tearing paper, and suddenly the plaster fell. First she fell on a harness, and then on me. It was like this for the next 30 to 40 minutes. Water was running, footsteps, a sound as if someone was tearing paper. Then I fell asleep, and I already woke up in a very bad mood.